Young black boy helps millionaire with flat tire. But what followed changed both their lives forever. What happens when a poor black boy with nothing gives everything? When a millionaire's luxury car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, he expects help to come with a price. But instead, a barefoot teenager walks out of the dust and changes everything. No cameras, no reward, just a moment so pure it shook a man who thought he had it all. But what the boy said next, it will leave you speechless. Stay with this story. It will challenge how you see wealth, dignity, and what it really means to give. Black boy helps millionaire. No one expected what happened. The Kentucky sun was ruthless that day, bearing down on the long stretch of cracked country road with a heat that shimmered like glass above the pavement. Everything around was still, except for the gentle hum of insects and the groan of an expensive silver Mercedes idling on the roadside. Its driver's side window rolled halfway down, leaking frustration into the heavy summer air. Inside sat Matthew Evans, 78 years old, retired, rich, and deeply inconvenienced. He was the kind of man who had built empires with a phone call, who once thought traffic was something that happened to other people. But here he was stranded, sweating through his linen shirt, thumbing at a phone that flashed no signal. Matthew tapped the steering wheel impatiently, jaw clenched. The air conditioner hissed, trying and failing to fight the furnace outside. His gaze shifted to the horizon, eyes narrowed behind designer lenses. No one was coming. No one ever did out here, and then someone did. A lone figure appeared down the road, small, walking, not hurried but not hesitant either. A boy. Maybe 13, maybe 14. Barely taller than the dusty fence line. His t-shirt was sun-bleached and stretched thin, his sneakers worn to the sole. There was nothing about him that screamed power, wealth, or even safety. Except maybe the calm in his stride. Matthew straightened a little, unsure. The boy kept coming. As he neared the car, his eyes scanned the flat tire without a word, then flicked up to meet Matthew's. "You got a flat, sir?" he asked. His voice wasn't timid. It was calm, level, like he'd asked this 100 times before. Matthew nodded, still thrown by the moment. "Yeah, no signal either. Can't get roadside service." The boy gave a small, polite smile. "I can help you with that." He knelt next to the car, inspecting the damage like a trained mechanic. No hesitation, no second glance, just action. Matthew blinked. Do you know how to change a tire?" "My grandpa taught me last summer," the boy said, already reaching for the trunk handle. "You got a spare?" Matthew pointed. The boy popped the trunk, pulled out the tools, and got to work like it was second nature. His hands, small but steady, moved with a quiet rhythm, precise and practiced. No wasted motion, just sweat, effort, and resolve. Matthew stepped out of the car, standing a few feet away, unsure what to say. Watching this child, this black child kneeling in the heat, helping him without question, without fear, something shifted inside him. There was no "yes, sir," dripping with obligation. No smile meant to make him comfortable. No performance of servitude. The boy simply worked. "What's your name?" Matthew asked after a moment. "Elijah," the boy replied without looking up. Elijah. There was something ancient in the name, strong, grounded. Matthew reached for his wallet, fingers brushing the thick stack of bills he always carried. A rich man's reflex. But before he could pull it out, Elijah stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, sweat clinging to his forehead. "All done," he said with quiet satisfaction. Matthew pulled out the bills. "Here, please, I really appreciate the help." But Elijah stepped back, hands raised gently, voice firm but kind. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. I'm just happy to help." Matthew froze. That sentence didn't fit in his world. People didn't just help. Not without motive, not without strings. But Elijah was already walking away, back down the road he came from, shoulders relaxed, head high. He didn't look back. Matthew stood beside his fixed car, money still in hand, watching the boy shrink into the distance. The weight of the bills suddenly felt foolish, heavy, insulting even. He slid the cash back into his wallet, but not with the same confidence. There was a quiet ache behind his ribs, unfamiliar, inconvenient. For the rest of the drive home, through winding hills and polished gates, Matthew Evans couldn't stop seeing Elijah's face. That simple smile, that dust-covered dignity, that refusal to be bought. In a world where everything had a price, Elijah had offered something no one else had in a long time: kindness, without condition. And Matthew, wealthy, powerful, alone, suddenly found himself on the wrong side of fortune. Because that boy, that poor black boy walking barefoot through a broken road, had something he had lost long ago: character. Black boy turns down cash. His reason left a millionaire speechless. The Merced sat quiet now, fully repaired, its sleek body gleaming under the southern sun like a polished silver trophy. But Matthew Evans, the man who owned it, stood outside the vehicle as if something more serious than a flat tire had just been fixed or broken. In his hand, he held out a folded stack of crisp 20s and 50s, a gesture as natural to him as breathing. Money had always been his solution. It was how he said thank you. It was how he moved the world. But the boy, Elijah, didn't even look at the cash. He simply took one step back and lifted a hand, palm open, in refusal. "No, thank you, sir," he said gently. "I don't need anything. I'm just happy I could help." There was no pride in his voice, no smugness, just calm certainty, the kind that silenced even a man like Matthew Evans. For a moment, the two stood frozen, an aging white millionaire and a young black boy in dust-covered sneakers, on opposite ends of an invisible line. One offered what the world called value. The other offered something the world had long forgotten. Matthew's lips parted, searching for words. "But I mean, really, that was generous of you. Let me do something in return." "You don't have to," Elijah said, already turning away, his voice drifting like wind through dry grass. "Sometimes help is just help." Matthew watched him walk back down the road, kicking at gravel, unbothered, light on his feet, not even glancing over his shoulder, as if that moment, helping a stranger, meant nothing more than the next breath. But for Matthew, it meant everything. He stood there for several minutes, the money still in his hand, the weight of it growing heavier with every second. It wasn't that Elijah had refused a tip. It was that he had refused the system. A system Matthew had spent a lifetime perfecting. A system built on reward, transaction, and leverage. And yet here was this boy, black, poor, probably unseen by the world, offering a gesture that required no receipt, no repayment, no return. It rattled something inside him, something buried beneath years of contracts, mergers, and high-rise deals. In Elijah's simple act was a quiet rebellion. Because in a society where people are taught to survive by taking, this boy had chosen to give. No strings, no performance, just kindness for its own sake. Back inside his car, Matthew sat silently for a long while before starting the engine. The road ahead of him stretched far, but his thoughts stayed behind, stuck on a dusty figure walking alone, shoulders back, pride intact. He remembered the shoes, worn down to the heel, and the shirt threadbare from use. This was not someone who could afford to give things away for free. And yet he did. Matthew's world, penthouses, stock portfolios, silent dinners, suddenly felt hollow. Like a museum built for one man, filled with everything except meaning. He thought about how many times he had paid someone to smile, how many favors he'd bought, how many acts of kindness he'd mistaken for strategy. And then he thought of Elijah. That look in the boy's eye, not one of servitude, not one of fear, but clarity, like he understood something the rest of the world had missed. It was the look of someone who had been taught that being kind wasn't weakness but strength. Matthew leaned back in his seat and whispered to no one. That kid, he didn't just fix my tire. He didn't have to finish the sentence. Because the truth was already sinking in. In a world so conditioned to expect payment for goodness, Elijah's refusal was a kind of revolution. A soft one, a silent one, but a revolution nonetheless. Millionaire questions everything after refusal from black teen. That night, in a mansion so large it echoed even when empty, Matthew Evans sat alone in his leather armchair, a crystal glass of scotch untouched in his hand. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the fireplace, shadows dancing along the mahogany walls and shelves of books no one had opened in years. His dinner sat cold beside him, steak, asparagus, imported wine. Arranged like artwork on a plate, he no longer had the appetite to admire. His thoughts were loud. Elijah. That name looped in his mind like a prayer or a question with no answer. He had met thousands of people in his 78 years, executives, senators, CEOs, lawyers who sold kindness for a price, and men who only did favors with cameras nearby. But none had left him feeling the way this boy did. Poor, black, and anonymous, yet unforgettable. Matthew leaned his head back, eyes heavy, not from age, but from something more tiring, memory. He thought back to his childhood. Before the polished cars and marble countertops, a house with peeling paint, a mother who skipped dinner so he could eat, a father who worked double shifts at the factory and still came home to read him scripture by the window. They were poor, yes, but there was pride, there was love, there was dignity. Then came the scholarships, the money, the deals, the compromises. Somewhere along the way, he learned the world didn't reward softness. It applauded power. And the higher he climbed, the further he drifted from the boy he used to be. Now he was rich, but hollow, and it had taken a barefoot teenager from Harlan to remind him. He took a long breath and stared out the tall window beside him. Beyond the trimmed hedges and perfect lawn was silence. There were no kids playing outside, no voices around the table, just wealth, quiet, sterile, and still. And Elijah had dust on his shirt, calluses on his fingers, holes in his shoes. But somehow the boy had looked richer. Matthew could still see his face, eyes steady and clear, turning down the money like it meant nothing. As if character was its own currency. Who raised a boy like that? Matthew muttered aloud, the sound bouncing off the cold walls. He reached for the remote to distract himself, but nothing on the massive screen could drown out that moment. The refusal, the calm, the freedom in it. Freedom, that's what it was. Matthew had spent a lifetime building walls of wealth, but Elijah walked with something more powerful. The kind of self-worth that couldn't be bought or borrowed. The kind that no bank could measure. And for the first time in years, Matthew felt exposed. Not humiliated, but seen. Because society had always taught black boys like Elijah to bow their heads, to accept less, to chase approval. To beg for opportunities they'd already earned. And here was this boy, standing in the sun, sweat dripping from his brow, saying no with grace. Not out of defiance, but out of dignity. Matthew turned his eyes back to the fire, whispering almost to himself. He didn't just change my tire, he changed something in me. No one answered, just the soft tick of the grandfather clock and the slow burn of guilt. He wasn't sure what he owed the boy, but he knew it was more than money, and far more than thanks. Because Elijah had done what few men in Matthew's world could. He'd made a rich man question the very thing he had built his life around. And the silence that followed was louder than anything Matthew had ever heard. Millionaire searches for boy who refused money, finds a deeper truth. Matthew Evans hadn't driven himself in years. But that morning, just after sunrise, he sat behind the wheel of his black SUV with no destination more urgent than the one only his heart understood. The sky was painted with soft gold, and the hum of the tires on old Kentucky roads filled the silence he used to drown in marble floors and soft jazz. He kept replaying it, Elijah's hands working quietly on the tire. His voice calm and free, the refusal, that walk away. Matthew didn't know the boy's last name, didn't have an address, but he had a feeling. And sometimes that's all a man needs when his soul is being pulled by something greater than logic. He stopped at gas stations and diners along the way, showing Elijah's face as best he could through description. Maybe 13, 14, Matthew told a young clerk in a faded convenience store. Black boy, skinny, kind eyes. Most people shook their heads, until a woman at a small roadside cafe wiped her hands on her apron and said, "You might be talking about Elijah. Lives with his mama over in Harlan. That boy's always helping somebody." Matthew whispered the name like it was sacred. Harlan, a forgotten town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. It wasn't marked by flashing signs or billboards, just winding roads, wooden porches, and stories etched into the faces of those who stayed. The closer he got, the slower he drove. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. He turned down a gravel path lined with modest homes. The yards were patchy, fences sagging, laundry swinging in the breeze like prayer flags. And then he saw it. A small house with paint peeling around the windows and a porch that leaned slightly, as if tired from holding itself up for too long. He parked out front and took a breath. Then he knocked. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her early 40s. Her skin was deep brown, her eyes sharp and searching. She wore a plain t-shirt, an apron stained with flour. But behind her cautious expression was a strength that didn't ask for permission to exist. "Yes," she asked, her voice neither cold nor welcoming. I met your son," Matthew said, stumbling over his own words. "Elijah. He helped me yesterday. I had to come thank him." Her posture softened. "That sounds like my Elijah. I tried to pay him. He wouldn't take a dime." She smiled gently, something proud flickering behind her eyes. "He wouldn't." "I don't want to intrude," Matthew said, "but may I speak with him?" She opened the door a little wider. "He's out back. You're welcome to come around." As Matthew stepped inside, he noticed the small details. A home that had seen hard times but was cared for like it mattered. The living room was small but warm. A few family photos hung on the walls. Crayon drawings, clearly Elijah's, were taped near the kitchen. There was no luxury here, but there was life, real life. Out back, Elijah was fixing a crooked fence post, a hammer clutched tightly in his small hands. He looked up, surprised. "Mister." Matthew smiled. "I had to find you." "You didn't have to do that," Elijah said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I didn't have a choice," Matthew said softly. Elijah tilted his head. "Why?" Matthew looked down at the ground. "Because you made me remember something I'd forgotten. What it means to help just to help." From the porch, Elijah's mother watched in silence, eyes soft with knowing. She stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron again. "You must have been raised by someone special," Matthew said, turning to her. She chuckled. "I try, it's not easy out here." "You've done more than try," he replied. The air settled for a moment, quiet and full. And then Matthew asked, "Do you mind if I sit a while?" "Please," she said. "I was about to make lunch. You're welcome to join us." Matthew hesitated. He couldn't remember the last time someone had invited him to a table without expecting something in return. Inside, the kitchen smelled of cornbread and simmering vegetables. The table was small, the chairs mismatched, but every detail had heart. And as they sat together, Matthew listened more than he spoke. Elijah talked about his school, his love for math, his dream of becoming an engineer. His mother shared stories about Elijah helping neighbors, fixing what little he could, always offering more than he had. Matthew's voice lowered. He has a kind of strength I've rarely seen. She looked at her son, smiling. He comes from people who had to be strong. Matthew nodded, the gravity of her words sinking in. Because black mothers have carried more than their share. They've held families together through systems designed to break them. Their sons walk with targets on their backs and hope in their pockets. And still, they teach them to lift others. As the conversation deepened, Matthew realized this wasn't just about Elijah. This was about the hands that had shaped him, the stories that had fed him, the mother who had taught him that character was something you wear even when your shoes have holes in them. And in that quiet home, surrounded by love not things, Matthew Evans found the kind of wealth his bank account could never hold. Poor black family invites Millionaire to lunch. He leaves in tears. The kitchen was nothing like the high-gloss marble rooms Matthew Evans was used to. There were no polished counters, no glass chandeliers or designer light fixtures. The walls were chipped in places and the floor creaked with every step. But it smelled like home. Not the kind you buy, but the kind you remember in your bones. The aroma of fresh cornbread mingled with the earthy warmth of collard greens and slow-cooked beans. A pot of sweet tea sat sweating on the counter beside a bowl of hand-peeled apples. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, and covered in a faded cloth patterned with sunflowers. Matthew hesitated at the threshold. "You're welcome to sit down," Elijah's mother said, gently pulling out a chair. "It ain't fancy, but it's honest." "I haven't sat at a kitchen table in a long time," Matthew murmured. "Well," she said with a soft smile, "then it's long overdue." Elijah washed his hands at the sink and took the seat beside his mother, motioning for Matthew to sit across from him. The millionaire lowered himself slowly into the rickety chair, his expensive suit jacket brushing the back of wood worn soft by years of use. As they bowed their heads in prayer, Matthew kept his eyes open, watching. Elijah's fingers were laced tightly, his lips moving in whispered reverence. His mother's voice was quiet but steady. "Lord, thank you for the food and for the company. Thank you for kindness returned. Amen." When the prayer ended, conversation began. Not small talk, not the polished performances of boardroom chatter, but real words. Laughter spilled naturally between bites. Elijah talked about school, how he liked science, how he was always taking things apart, trying to understand how they worked. "I want to be an engineer," he said with a kind of quiet certainty. Matthew looked up from his plate. "An engineer?" "Yes, sir, I want to design things, fix things that matter." His mother reached over and tousled his hair gently. "He's always got tools in his pockets, lost 3 good spoons to his inventions." Elijah grinned. "They made pretty good propellers." Matthew chuckled, genuinely this time. "You've got the mind for it and the heart." That made the boy pause. Then he asked, "Did you always know what you wanted to be?" Matthew looked down at his plate. The question felt heavier than it should have. "I used to," he said slowly. "But somewhere along the way I started chasing what I thought I was supposed to want: money, status, success." He lifted his gaze and looked around the kitchen. "But I can't remember the last time any of it felt like this." Elijah's mother stood and brought more cornbread to the table. She didn't speak, but her eyes met Matthew's with a knowing that needed no words. Here in this small room with cracked paint and second-hand dishes, Matthew felt something he hadn't in decades: belonging. Not because of who he was, but because of who they were, because love lived here. It filled every corner of the room like light through lace curtains, and it made him realize how dark his mansion had become. He watched as Elijah broke off a piece of cornbread and slid it across the table. "Try this one," he said. "Mama adds honey when she knows company's coming." Matthew took a bite. It was sweet, warm, a little rough around the edges, just like this family. He leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the food sinking into him like sunlight. This was wealth, he thought. This was what money tried to mimic but never quite reached. The kind of richness passed down in stories, in habits, in quiet strength. He looked again at Elijah. A boy with dusty shoes, big dreams, and a soul his world tried to overlook. And Matthew realized this wasn't just a meal. It was a lesson, and he was finally ready to listen. Millionaire secretly rebuilds black boy's home. But that wasn't all he changed. The first truck rolled up just after dawn, its engine humming softly against the quiet of the neighborhood. The rising sun cast golden light across the porch of a house that had stood too long under the weight of time and struggle. It was the kind of house that whispered resilience, even when the boards creaked and the paint peeled. Matthew stood on the sidewalk in work boots and a baseball cap pulled low. No suit, no fanfare, just a clipboard and a promise he hadn't said out loud. This wasn't charity, it was gratitude. The crew unloaded lumber, tools, and roofing material. Hammers clanged. Power saws whirred. Neighbors peeked from behind screen doors, their morning routines interrupted by something that didn't happen in Harlan. Hope, delivered in plain white trucks. Across the street, an old man leaned on his cane and muttered, "Ain't seen that much wood since the church got rebuilt after the storm." Inside the house, Elijah's mother stepped out onto the porch, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Matthew turned to her with quiet sincerity. "You've done more with less than most ever will. You raised a boy this world can't ignore. That deserves more than just words." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "Then let me make you some lemonade," she said, retreating into the kitchen. Elijah watched from the top step, barefoot, silent. His eyes didn't shine with excitement, they burned with curiosity. He wasn't just watching, he was learning. By noon, he was crouched near a worker named Joe, a thick man with a bandana wrapped around his forehead, measuring 2x4s and explaining angles. "You see this?" Joe said, drawing a line with a carpenter's pencil. "This cut's gotta be precise, or the whole frame leans wrong." Elijah nodded. "So it's like balance. If one piece is off, the others fall." Joe smiled. "You got an eye for this." Matthew watched the boy's mind light up like a match struck in the dark. Every nail that hit the wood echoed louder than a donation ever could. This wasn't about giving. It was about equipping. Elijah didn't need saving. He needed space to grow. And now the house was becoming more than a shelter. It was becoming a school. A place where calloused hands taught skills, where curiosity was fed instead of ignored. By the third day, the porch was replaced with strong new planks. The old swing set in the backyard, rusted and leaning, was swapped for one Elijah helped bolt together. The kitchen was painted in soft yellows and whites. The roof, once patched with sheets of tin, now stood solid and sealed. Neighbors began stopping by with casseroles, sweet tea, handshakes, and quiet awe. "I never thought I'd see this place shine," one woman whispered to Matthew. "It always deserved to." And that was the truth. Places like this weren't broken because of failure. They were neglected because the world never expected them to rise. Matthew stood by the fence one afternoon, arms crossed, watching Elijah measure a doorframe beside a carpenter. "You ever think about building houses one day?" Matthew asked. Elijah didn't look up. "I think about building everything," he said. Houses, bridges, maybe even spaceships. If I can figure out how things work, I can fix what's broken. Matthew swallowed hard. That was it, right there. What no amount of money could manufacture. Vision. Elijah wasn't dreaming of escape. He was dreaming of impact. He wasn't trying to leave where he came from. He was trying to build something better from it. And Matthew knew then what this was really about. It wasn't just about a house. It was about honoring the potential the world overlooks in black communities every day, not with pity, but with tools. With time, with trust, because black children like Elijah don't need to be saved. They need to be seen. Black teens' final words leave Millionaire forever changed. The sun dipped low behind the hills of Harlan, casting long orange shadows across the front porch. The wood was new, freshly stained, still smelling faintly of cedar. Wind chimes made from old spoons and copper wire clinked softly as dusk settled in. Matthew sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, watching Elijah race across the yard with two neighborhood kids. Their laughter rang out into the evening air, rising above the smell of cut grass and warm earth. It had been weeks since that flat tire. Weeks since a stranger in a suit met a boy in tattered sneakers on a back road in Kentucky. Now the boy had a new swing set, a repaired roof, a home that stood tall again, but what stayed with Matthew wasn't the renovations. It was the way Elijah's spirit never changed, still humble, still kind, still curious. As the kids slowed and collapsed in the grass, breathless and grinning, Elijah walked back to the porch, sweat on his forehead, joy still glowing on his face. He sat beside Matthew and stretched his legs out. "You tired?" Matthew asked. Elijah grinned, not yet, just thinking. "About what?" Elijah paused for a moment, then looked up at the sky turning purple. "I want to do something like this one day," he said. Matthew turned to him, eyebrows lifted. "Like what?" "Help people, not because I have to, because it matters, like you did." Matthew was silent, his throat tightened. "You already do help people," he said softly. "You helped me." Elijah looked surprised. "But I didn't do much." "Yes, you did," Matthew said. "You gave without expecting anything. That's rare, that's powerful." Elijah shrugged, eyes thoughtful. "Mama always says you don't have to be rich to give, you just have to care enough to show up." The words hit deeper than any business lesson Matthew had ever learned. He sat still, breathing them in. Behind them, Elijah's mother stepped out, handing Matthew a cup of sweet tea. She smiled. "You'll always have a seat here." Matthew took the glass with a nod. "Thank you. I think this might be the first place I've truly felt welcome in a long time." She didn't say anything, just gave him a look that said she understood more than he'd ever say aloud. As the sky deepened and the cicadas began their chorus, Elijah leaned his head back against the porch rail. You think people like me can really change things?" he asked. Matthew turned fully toward him. "Yes, absolutely. You already are. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Elijah didn't speak for a while. Then he said, almost to himself, "Then I'll keep showing up, one person at a time." Matthew watched him, and in that moment he realized something he'd missed his whole life. Giving wasn't about what you had in your bank account. It was about what you had in your heart and the courage to offer it. And here in the soft glow of twilight, with no cameras, no applause, no headlines, something larger than wealth passed between them. Legacy, not written in stone but in kindness, not measured in money but in moments. Because not everyone can build houses or fix broken tires or donate fortunes, but everyone can show up. Everyone can choose to care. And when they do, it plants a seed, just like Elijah had. A seed that grows into something that lasts, something stronger than buildings, something louder than hate, something the world desperately needs more of: goodness, given freely, held with dignity, passed on like light. Sometimes it takes just one quiet act of kindness to remind us what truly matters. Not status, not money, but the way we choose to show up for one another. Elijah didn't change the world with wealth, he did it with heart. And in doing so, he changed a life. This story reminds us that we all carry the power to give, to build, and to leave something good behind. Not everyone has riches, but we all have a choice to lead with compassion, to act with dignity, and to believe in each other's worth. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how Elijah's quiet strength spoke to you. And don't miss what's coming next. We'll be bringing you more powerful, untold stories of the Black experience, stories of injustice, of resilience, and of triumph that will challenge what you thought you knew. These are not just stories. They're lessons in strength, in faith, and in the unstoppable spirit of a people who rise again and again. Your journey with us is just beginning.